Sounds good. All right. Well, my clock says 1 minute after the top of the hour, so I think we will get started. I think we're going to have plenty of time today to get through our topics, but well, we'll just see where the discussion takes us. So this is the second of our two meetings. I believe this is the first time this group has had two meetings during an IETF meeting, but we certainly filled up most of our hour the last time and all the administrative topics. And so today we're just going to walk through a number of more specific technical topics, and hopefully we'll get enough technical discussion in there to feel good about that, although we are going to have a bit of process to go with it too. So, okay. All right, well, I'm trying out this cool thing over here, which doesn't seem to want to actually allow, doesn't want to do updates. That's okay. I'll go back to my other window over here and I will manage the slides manually. So that works too. All right, this is the note well. This is a reminder, please, to everyone about the policies and procedures with which the IETF operates and how we work and the things that we believe are important in terms of how we get our work done. It really is important that you understand and take the time to read through the various policies that are all highlighted down there at the bottom and understand that if you make a contribution or participate here, that all of these rules and policies apply to you. And it's important that you take the time to understand them and look at them. As one particular item, we do like to call out and remind everyone that, you know, we are a respectful environment. We are focused on the substance here, not on people. And if anyone feels that, you know, they have in any way been intruded upon, that we do have a process for all of that. We have an ombuds team to whom you can approach if you have a particular concern and confidentiality is important to you. You're also welcome to reach out to your working group chair or area director about any particular issue that you might have. But a reminder, please, let's keep our discussions and discourse focused on technical issues. And this applies in all IETF related activities. Okay. IETF Code of Conduct guidelines. I've pretty much covered this quite directly, but, you know, reminder, treat each other with respect, speaking slowly and without slang, you know, sort of things that hopefully you have heard many times. This is day 3 of the IETF, and this is a pretty standard set of slides, which should have been in front of you for each and every working group meeting. Okay, this is agenda bashing. This is the agenda that we had set up for today. So this is just a quick run for people here. Do you have any questions or concerns? You want to reorder this? There were some slides that have been updated quite recently this morning for some of these things. So if you, I do believe that there is a slide here for everything that's on this list now. So if you feel like you haven't seen a slide for a topic, you might want to go look at it. All of the detailed, extensive slides have been previously distributed, but there are some last minute 1 or 2 slides for 3 or 4 of these topics here. And I guess I'm the one who's pretty much guilty of those. I put them up this morning for the last 3 topics on this list. But hopefully people are familiar with the topics, and so that's just to guide the discussion that we're going to have here. I'm not seeing any hands or comments coming up, so we'll jump right into our welcome and introductions. We've already done the note well. usual kind of note scribe, look around, and I see Rick raising his hand again. So thank you very much, Rick. He does that a lot for us, and so we owe him a significant vote of thanks for putting our actions and gathering our decisions in our notes area. Okay. Moving on, so into existing work. So there's one item we're going to cover under this. Existing work is one of our, pro forma agenda items. But the issue that's here, and this is the one slide to cover this particular topic, is about internationalized email addresses. Now, this topic has been around actually for a number of years in this working group. It took us quite a while to get to the version that we had sent around, which is the link which is there. This existed in the IESG's queue itself for, I think, even a year all by itself. It certainly predates Ori by quite some time, and I'm pretty sure it predates him by a year, as well as all the time that he's been here. So what we did was we ran into some problems. We had quite some extensive discussions on our mailing list about this document, but we came to some consensus, we submitted it, and then it hit IETF last call, and it ran into significant problems. Again, we had some real concerns coming out of the email contingency in the IETF. And we spent quite some time going through this and trying to deal with it. I know that I myself invested a great deal of energy and effort in trying to find a path through the concerns that came out of IETF last call. The end result of all of this was, Ori as area director, in the end, they decided to hand this back to us and remand it back to the working group, thinking that, this was really something the working group should revisit and reconsider. And I guess having invoked your name, Ori, please jump into the queue here.
Thanks. So I want to apologize first for, having to send this back to the working group. I know you've all spent a lot of time discussing this document. I'm here to support continued progression on the document. I'm happy to provide reviews to the process. The main sort of point I wanted to raise here is that when the document comes through to me, I want to make sure that you're all comfortable with it and that we're not running into these at the latest stage. And so, I apologize for having to hand the document back to you all, but I'm here to help you work through any of the challenges with it, including coordinating with other working groups, other areas. So I stand ready to assist you. And thank you to the chairs and to the authors for your patience in processing the document.
Yes, thank you. Appreciate that very much. It has been a challenge to deal with some of the issues, but I think that we've also where we are right now is I, along with Art, well, I'm just going to butcher his last name, so I'm just not even going to go there. Aren't. But we had been focused on trying to find edits to the original proposal that would ideally, get past the concerns that were raised during IETF last call. In addition, there is another set of people, and there is another draft which has been pulled together after this document was remanded back to the working group. In the background, there was another set of people that have now also created a draft, and it's a much simplified draft and to how to deal with this issue and where to go with it. So in a way, it's kind of a rewrite essentially of the work altogether. So I was also reminded by one of our working group members here that there is another option here that's not on this slide. So it was remanded back to the working group, and we essentially have three options for what we want to do, although only two of them are mentioned on the slide here. One option is we could just decide to walk away from this work and say, okay, well, since we couldn't get consensus in the IETF, maybe we should just be done and walk away from this work. And it is fair to, bring to the working group to understand that that is an option. Speaking personally, I don't accept that that's an option, because I think that we really do need a solution to being able to carry internationalized email addresses in EPP. I just don't think that that's something that we can escape. The world needs this, and I think that it is an obligation that that work happen. If this working group wants to put it aside, then that just means that, those among us who really want this done will have to reach out to our area director and find a different way to get it done. My feeling is he'll probably end up tossing it back to us anyway and saying, why don't you guys want to work on it? That's just my opinion, speculation. I don't know. So what I really think is it brings us down to these two choices here. One is rewriting the document or continuing to try to find an edit of the existing proposal. My personal point of view, being as on the team of people who was working towards rewriting, actually the two sets of us for these two documents, kind of found each other early on in this week. So we kind of got ourselves together and exchanged our work. And we're now working together to pull together a document. And in fact, I'm inclined to work with the simplified proposal, as is Arndt, the guy who was working with me to do the edits. And so we're working with the other set of authors, and we do fully expect to reconcile all of the things that we think need to be there, that should happen, and that document then will come out in the very near future, within just a few weeks here. And having seen that simplified proposal, at least from my own personal point of view, I think it's good. I'm hopeful that it will pass the working group, and I'm equally hopeful that it will get past the IETF last call concerns that were raised before. Of course, those are both processes we're going to have to go through, but it is what it is, and here we are. So now as chair, my advice to the working group is that wait for a new document to come, and then we will revisit the technical discussion, and we'll do the normal working group review, and we'll move forward from there. But actually, this is now an open discussion. If anyone has a different idea, a different preference, you want to object altogether, given that this slide does not talk about, abandoning the work, certainly open to hearing any opinions or comments about any of that, but also any votes of support or competence for the path that we're going down. And I see Jim Gould has joined the queue. So please, Jim, go ahead.
Yeah, as co-editor of this draft, I've seen both, I guess, versions of the draft that are up for consideration. And I do agree that the simplified one is probably the most likely version that we'll be able to get through. So I'm supportive of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Very good to hear that. Appreciate it. Scott, you're up next.
Thank you, Jim. Scott Hollenbeck. I don't mind admitting that I'm one of the guilty parties associated with that group that Jim described. I do think it's important, though, to maybe go into just a little bit of detail of what the simplification entails. I noticed that John Clenson is not with us, so I don't want to speak for him, but I should note that one of the ways I kind of came to the end point where I did with this simplified proposal was by having a direct conversation with John about the concerns that he had shared earlier, which kind of focused on two areas. One was the fact that the current draft implicitly updates both RFC 5733 and other extensions that include email addresses. So now he had some concerns about what was described on the mailing list as a functional extension, which does not exist in our BCP describing how to extend EPP. So one goal of this simplified approach was to not go there. The other goal of the simplified approach was leave the base 5733 contact object alone, meaning it continues to be allowed to carry only an all ASCII email address, and simplify the extension part such that it can carry one additional email address that is either all ASCII or SMTP UTF-8. All right, there's also an indication there for if that address should be considered the primary address to be associated with the contact. Because much like in the way DNS works with mail servers, if you have a list of them, well, the question becomes one of, well, which one do I try to use first, right? Anyway, So that's the basic idea behind the simplification. As Jim said, this is a very drafty draft. I think we still have a lot of things to talk about before it's ready to really see the light of day. But if anyone has concerns about us following that kind of a path of simplification, I do think it'd be good to kind of get those out there now before we invest a whole lot of energy in publishing a draft only to have it be DOA.
Thank you, Scott. I'll just add that, like Scott, Arndt and I were actually talking with John Clinton also about our draft and our work and trying to address his concerns and what we proposed. The big fundamental difference, which Scott has just highlighted here between the two paths that we took, was Scott's comment that the simplified version seeks to make sure that nothing would be considered an update to 5733. It is true that the path that we were headed down, because it was the same as the original core, there was an argument that could be made. We didn't actually, we never made that argument here in this working group, but after some, other additional discussions, I realized that when Scott had focused on that particular issue of not wanting to risk updating 5733, one could argue that even the original proposal, there was a path which suggested it might be considered an update to 5733. And, so we're all in agreement now. We don't want that to happen. And so doing something and doing a rewrite, that's a critical reason why. And we're all in agreement there. So just wanted to highlight that point. Edmund, you're up next.
Yeah, Edmund here. I put up my hand actually to ask the question of what are we simplifying. So thank you, Scott, for clarifying that. But then, so just to lend my support, I think this is an important piece of feature for EPP. So glad to see it move forward.
Thank you, Edmund. Appreciate that. And Missile?
Q Missile, MPI Inf, fan of simplification and internationalization. I think in general, a simplified protocol is always better. There should be good reason to do something more complicated. However, in this case, I know you've just given an overview wherever you're sitting, Scott, but I have concerns about what if the only email address available is a UTF-8 email address. I'm not going to go tell my customer, hi, you need to register an ASK email address. And in addition, like their email address is their email address. I can't just tell them, no, your email address is wrong, because that's false. That is their email address. So I'm not objecting to the way the simplification is being done, but it may still require an update to 5733 to say, oh, this field can be blank or something similar. That might still be a neater way of doing it than what has been thrown back to us, but I don't think we should simplify at the expense of proper internationalization.
So thank you for that. And that question actually is in front of us. We're very aware of that question and do plan to deal with it and address that. That is a question that, I've had all along too about all of this. And that was actually one of the last call comments that came around, is making sure that you didn't obligate people to have both addresses. So, and with that, I also want to add that to be sure, the document that does come out, it will get a full and complete airing in the working group. It can be considered new text, and so you will have plenty of opportunity to make sure that your issues are covered, they've been addressed, and to comment on anything that you think is incomplete. So thank you. Pete.
Pete Resnick, just to reassure Q a little on this point, remember that if you only have an EAI address, you can't use standard SMTP mechanisms to get a piece of email. You have to have all of the SMTP extensions that go with it. So even the simplified document, I think at some levels is going to have to say, okay, if you want to use standard mechanisms to receive email, you're going to have to provide an ASCII email address. And if you don't have one of those, you have to understand that you're only getting it through this other path. And, people who implement EPP can either have implemented one path or say, nope, sorry, you need to at least give us some way to get through to you that doesn't involve these extensions. I think that's fine.
Okay, thank you, Pete. And I think with that, I will close this by saying out loud that at least the sense of the room is, people would like to see the rewrite, and then we'll go from there. So we'll just consider this an open action item, as it has been, unfortunately, for quite a long time, but hopefully we can move this along relatively quickly once a new document is there. And Ori, please.
So I'm delighted with the energy in the room to proceed with that. Just make sure you confirm it on the list so that folks who aren't here, can't be in the room, have a chance. Thanks.
Yes, thank you for the reminder always. Okay, so we now have 6 topics to walk through. We are a little bit behind where I had thought we would be, but I think we'll be okay. So we're going to walk through these presentations, and we'll take the time that we have and see where we are. So Powell, you are up first. You can come on up while I get your slides going here. Unfortunately, it seems you cannot control the slides because that won't work.
All right, so thank you for having me. I'm Paweł Kowalik from DINIC. However, this presentation, this part of work will be, it's not catching. This part of work is not related to my affiliation, so I'm presenting this as individual.
You really need to eat the mic.
Yeah. And it's too loud.
Especially with the background noise in this
It's good?
room.
It's good? All right. So a bit of history about this work. So it has been presented by this group already a few years ago. So I think some of the folks who are long enough here may remember it in Berlin, 2016. So it has been continued the work at IETF till 2018 with some updates, but after that the original authors moved away to other areas, but the protocol itself evolved, and that's why I want to present you some update how it goes. Next slide, please. So reminder what it is. So it's an application level protocol of provisioning the DNS records to the mainly to the second level zones, basically allowing the zone owners to provision these records without really too much deep technical knowledge what is in these records, because this is defined by the service provider. So basically this allows the integration between service providers and DNS operators in this sense. It makes much less complicated for the end user. It's based on the templates which define what kind of set of records is provisioned, which also allows for a very dedicated authorization of this process. And in the end, it has the operational benefit for both the service provider and DNS provider, because the process is seamless and involves less of the, let's say, moving parts of copy pasting of the content. Next slide, please. So in simple flow, how it works. So the end user would come to the service provider to where let's say a web interface or a user interface, and will express the wish to connect the service with a domain. Behind the scenes, the domain will be looked up over DNS, who is the operator of this zone. And when the discovery would be successful, the service provider would, let's say, compose a URL link, which basically tells how to provision the service. And in the next step, the let's say user will be redirected to this DNS provider. After authentication, authorization of this process, the DNS records will be provisioned to the zone, and after that, the service would be properly connected to the domain. Next slide, please. So the protocol has also some additional features. So the templates I already mentioned, they define how the record structure looks like. They have also built-in variables, so basically the template doesn't have to be fully static. So if there's, for example, a verification code to prove the ownership of the domain name, which is very often the use case, I don't know, for SSL provisioning or all this stuff. It can be provided as a variable to the template and basically provisioned with the flow. It has two variants. One is, let's say, for simple cases of one-off provisioning, where basically the flow closes when the records are provisioned. And there is the second flow with OAuth layer, which basically authorizes the updates to the template also at the latest stage. There is also a conflict resolution built into the protocol. So basically, if a new template would conflict with something that is already existing in the zone, the user will be very informed, okay, this email service that I'm provisioning right now will remove the setup that I have already for other email service, so there will be no surprises. When an email is concerned, there is also this small issue of SPF, which basically can be composed of different providers wanting to send emails under domain. So Domain Connect also addresses this issue that basically this composing of SPF can happen, let's say, seamlessly. There is also support for temporary DNS records, which are only important for, let's say, short period of time, like this verification records. And there are also some security measures not to, let's say, spoof this URL, which is, let's say, being authorized. And basically that there's a typo. And there is a signature in this URL built in. Right, next slide, please. So this is the interesting part, because back then, 2016, it was presented as a proposal from one of the DNS providers. And after this period, there was not that much visibility what's going on, but actually I was one of the people working with other DNS providers and service providers, basically to improve the standards, to add, let's say, the necessary features and to make it, let's say, workable across the ecosystem. So there are like 20 DNS providers right now implementing it. What we know of, at least, on the service provider sides, it's much wider adoption. Like it's 120 providers which are, let's say, publicly known, implementing it with even more services. So the specification is quite stable. Why I'm here? Because the community feels that this actually requires standardization to, let's say, enable also some other entities to integrate it, which are right now a bit reluctant, looking at that it doesn't have a, let's say, formal base as a standard. Next slide, please. Yeah, so the way forward, so there is a draft. Let's say the most recent version of the specification has been published, and I would love to hear some feedback from this group, because I think that, at least many of the stakeholders on the registrar side and on the service side are sitting in this room. Also, if you have any feedback, which other groups may be interested in this work or can contribute, give feedback, I would love to hear about this. And also, let's say, looking for some guidance how to proceed with this work and towards standardization, especially that it right now is not fitting well any charter of any group. So it's on one aspect is DNS part, but on the application level, so not really the protocol itself. And on the other side is it's not particularly EPP or RDAP, but I think there's the right audience here. All right.
So thank you. And just to be clear for all here, it's not on the slide here, but Howell and I have actually talked. I mean, I think there is a question here before the working group that will come out eventually, which is if we would like this working group to take on this work, he does know that he can send a message to the mailing list and ask for the working group to adopt it, and then the chairs will will do the part that needs to happen. But that's really what's behind here in this work. The other questions about whether or not it fits into our charter, I have to talk to Ori, and we have to see what's going on and see how he wants to handle that. But that we can all do separately. With that, we have a bit of a queue here, so let's go ahead. Scott, please.
Thank you, Jim. Scott Hollenbeck. Pavel, I very much like this, very much. But both you and Jim have already talked about the one question in my head. Where is the right place, right? This isn't EPP, it isn't RDAP. Right now, our charter is kind of limited to extensions to EPP and RDAP. Having said that, I don't think there's a better place in the IETF for it either. So is it REGEXT? Is it a new working group? I don't know, but as you said, Jim, this is something we're going to talk about. I think this is definitely a discussion worth having.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. Q.
Q myself, speaking with my domain DNS provider hat on this time. I agree this is a difficult one to place in the IETF, but I think this might be the best place because technically it is an extension to DNS and DNS configuration, so that would put it in the DNS operations working group. But the type of person who is going to be using this is the type of person who is using their registrar's DNS server. So it probably makes more sense here. We should tell the DNS operations working group about this work if it gets adopted here and make sure that they are informed on this. But I have no objections to putting it in this working group and, if necessary, rechartering. The second point I have is more technical, and that is from a quick skim of the draft. Everything seems to be based, in the simple case, at least on HTTP GET requests. I would advise that you make an update to allow HTTP POST requests, because if I have, say, 5 DKIM signatures I want to provision, that's going to be longer than the URL is allowed to be. So come up with a better way to deal with, I have a lot of data I would like to put in DNS. That's not to say I don't dislike the standard. I quite like the standard. It seems quite neat. But that's one small technical issue I noticed.
Thank you.
If I can just directly respond to it. So there is some practical, let's say, benefit of using GET requests. However, I take your point, so it may be useful addition. Right now, the standard allows for this in the OAuth flow because this one is happening, let's say, server to server. But thank you for feedback. Yeah.
Thank you. Hans, you're up next.
Yeah, this is Hans here from Odriga, email migration and data portability enthusiast. And yeah, I just want to say that's a very important work, especially for people who want to move their services and thus DNS records between providers. So I very much like and appreciate the work of keeping this going on and hopefully having it finished as a draft. Thank you.
Thank you. Jim, next.
Jim Reid. Pavel, I think this is great work, and I think it's a good idea to do it here rather than try to shove it across to DNSOP. We can just let them know that this activity is going on here, and if anyone from the DNSOP team feels that they have to contribute, they can come to this particular working group. Because the fact is, this is a relatively straightforward, self-contained problem. I think it's better dealt with in the registry context. And of course, bear in mind, of course, if it's touching on DNS, it will end up coming to the DNS directorate one way or another. Says me making a shameless plug.
Thank you, Jim Reid. Jim Gould, you're next.
Yeah, I wanted to say that I was first off impressed with the level of adoption of Domain Connect, since it's been many years since I reviewed it. So hats off to the team doing the work on it. I'm really not sure whether or not REGEXT is the right place for Domain Connect, since I believe there would be the need for more DNS providers to be involved. Since I don't believe registries are involved with Domain Connect. Correct me if I'm wrong.
That's correct, Jim. But we have we often have participation problems nonetheless. But I'm sure we can find a way to make sure that we get some DNS review and activity over our work here. certainly the DNS directorate is accessible to us, and we can always submit documents to them for active review in advance of any submission to the IESG. So we'll see. Thank you. Rick, go ahead.
Rick Wilhelm, PIR. I'll pick a chunk of what Scott said and a chunk of what Jim Reed said, and plus one, both of those. I think this is a good thing to support, and better here than anywhere else. And what Jim Reed said, in that the DNS directorate would get a look at it regardless, and the DNS op folks can come on in. I also, a point that I don't think anyone's made, there's some other proposals about how DNS operators can be doing updates to DNS configurations that have been going on inside of DNS op that a number of us have been watching. They're extraordinarily, and this is just my opinion, clunky with polling and CDNS. And I say that with, all kind of love to anybody with an earshot that is like been pushing on this stuff. And I know people have been working on these multi-DNS provider things and switching them and stuff like that, but those things are just awfully clunky. Domain Connect, since the folks at GoDaddy put it out there years ago, has been, it works. And like Jim Gould, I was surprised at how many people have actually adopted. So I think that this is actually pretty good, Pavel, that you're bringing it up and saying, hey, so many people have adopted it. Let's make it a standard that would actually encourage it more and encourage more kind of good behavior like this. And so I think it's kind of great. So in like here, why not here as good as any other place? Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. And thank you, Paul. Oh, did you
if I may, direct feedback. So yes, I was having also conversations about whether Domain Connect can be used to provision the ISO records, for example. Yes, it can be used. It requires some extension, but this kind of work which I would love to be putting forward.
Okay, thank you. One more speaker, Suzanne.
Yeah, sorry about jumping your queue, but I'll claim privilege of having been called out as DNS Op co-chair. We can ask people to take a look at the draft. We actually have at least one other draft also that we're supposed to be calling to people's attention in tomorrow's meeting, so we can certainly do that. Just, here this is. Here's why it might be interesting to people in DNS Op. After that, usually the way, if you're not sure which of two groups a draft belongs in, the chairs will discuss with ADs and so on and so forth, and there'll be something worked out. But there's no reason to worry about cross-group review, because that we can do.
Thank you, Suzanne. And yeah, so thank you, Powell. And I'll just add as my own summary. Yeah, no, it's okay. My personal view about this is I do think that this work is better placed here than DNS Op, but ultimately that decision will be made by the area directors and the chairs of the two groups. We'll chat and we'll figure out what we think works best. So what I'm taking away from this discussion is a couple of questions, but the sense of at least this room in the moment is that this particular working group is a reasonable home for this work. We'll continue to go down that path. As with all things, we'll certainly make this known on the working group mailing list, and we'll check in with our area directors here about what really is the best place. So, okay. With that, let's go to our next item on our list. I should go over here and put that slide up over here for myself so I don't have to keep going back to this one. RESTful EPP. Oh, he even knows. You don't have to wait for me to bring it up. Okay. And here we are. Please go ahead.
Yeah, next slide, please. So this is RESTful EPP. For those of you who are new to RESTful EPP, a short recap. It's basically a mapping of the existing functionality and data model for EPP on a RESTful API. And doing this results in some added value, as in improved scalability and performance options, better usability for developers and end users. And security-wise, you would be able to use all the existing HTTP security schemes that are available. And also importantly, it may help avoid fragmentation in the EPP ecosystem because we see right now that there are multiple registries that are already developing or already have developed REST-like interfaces for domain provisioning. Another item is that next to XML, there is also JSON support for EPP. And there are two documents, one describing the API itself together with the XML data model, and one where the JSON data model is being described. Next, please. So since presenting last meeting, we have been busy working with working on the open API spec for the API, for the RESTful API. We actually worked on it during the hackathon last weekend. Currently, we implemented some JSON support already by automatically generating or converting the existing EPP XSDs into JSON schema. And using the open API spec, we're able to generate client and server stubs for multiple language bindings. And we also already have a working proof of concept that includes extension support, for example, DNSSEC. And we are and continue to be working on running code for a reference implementation. And we also talked, or actually presented this during the last Center Jamboree meeting. For those of you who don't know, Center is an association for European registries. And we got positive feedback from this community, as in, okay, this is something we are very interested in, that we would like to be able to use, or are actually already using in some form. Next slide, please. So, a little time. Little.
You have an impressively bass voice.
Okay. Let me try this. Okay. This is better. Better. Okay. Sorry. No drilling. So yeah. Sorry. So I have to go back to Prague where we first presented this, and the consensus there was that okay, this is useful and potentially important work. And the feedback was that, well, maybe it's a good idea to create a split between the existing XML and the evolution to JSON. That's why we created two different documents. And then during the meeting in Brisbane earlier this year, again, support, but also concern that it may not be fully compliant with RFC 5730. And concerns about how to move forward with regards to the charter for REGEXT, as this work may not be covered by the current charter. And on the mailing list, there are similar consensus. Okay, this is something we should be able to work on, but does it fit the charter? Do we need to re-charter? So a lot of questions there. Next slide, please. So that's why we're here again, to ask this group, okay, what is the best path forward from here? So how do we fit this work into the IETF process? Can we adopt this as a work for this group? Even there are questions about, okay, what it actually is. Is it an extension? Is it more than an extension? Does it fit in the working group charter or not? We would prefer to be able to work on it further within this working group, because we think it does fit very well, even though there might be a need for a re-charter, and if so, then we would like to do that in parallel. Or another option would be create a new working group. If the group thinks, okay, this doesn't really fit here, or if there are other reasons to create a new working group. So I would really, start the discussion now, just to see, okay, what are the opinions in this room? What is the best option to go for, or are there other options not listed here? So please let us know.
You have one more slide. Did you want to go to that or?
Sorry,
Maybe
I
at
thought
the
that
end.
was the end.
No, okay.
Okay.
Oh.
Thank you, Michael. Again, I don't think this can be classed an extension. I think this is a entire re-implementation of EPP. I don't think that's a bad thing, and I think it is in this working group that it should be. I quite like the idea of making EPP RESTful because in its current state it is a bit weird to deal with sometimes, and it would be much nicer to just, it maps quite well to RESTful semantics anyway, so I see this as a good thing to do. I have opinions on doing it once in XML and then doing it again in JSON. My possibly spicy take is that XML is actually better than JSON for this, and we should not do it in JSON at all. I recognize that people will disagree with me, and sure, but if we're re-implementing EPP in its entirety anyway, then we should just skip straight to JSON. If we go, well, let's define it in XML and then let's define it in JSON later, we'll end up with 3 implementations of EPP, not 2. And that will be even more annoying to deal with. And it's like, well, which one do I have to implement? And sure, some of them share similar semantics, but it is in effect still 3 completely separate implementations. I personally would quite like to just see a mapping of XML to RESTful EPP and forget about JSON, because I think JSON has problems about extensibility, and the extensible part of EPP is quite important. I'm happy to elaborate further on that, not at the microphone.
Yeah, thanks. So the idea is not to re-implement everything in JSON again, but try to convert the existing data model used in EPP, like all the object mappings and extensions, to JSON schema, and to prevent any issues in the JSON part from impacting the development of the API with XML. There's a split between like the basic API and XML and the JSON part. So we could have a API with XML and not yet have the JSON support, and continue working on that and have it later on.
Okay, before we continue back to the queue, I want to take a moment to frame this discussion from a chair's perspective on what is and is not in scope here. So there is the question of asking for this to be work taking on by us. And much like Domain Connect, I mean, the working group certainly has its own opinion about that, but ultimately, whether or not something is new work or that, the more that something becomes something different than who we claim to be, it becomes a decision of the area director and chairs of other working groups as to where work lands. In the case of this particular work, I want to tease something apart here. In my mind, as chair, as long as this does not change the EPP data model, then it represents EPP. And in that context, it belongs in this working group, nowhere else. And to the extent that that's true, I look at this and I say, this is just suggesting a different transport for EPP. Okay, so that's sort of one path as a way to think about this. On the other hand, if you think of EPP as just the XML-based thing, and if this is going to go down the path of a JSON representation, is that a not EPP path? Which means it's not EPP anymore because it's something entirely different for provisioning. And to the extent that that's the bias that people have as you think about it, that tells me I'm less inclined for it to be in this group, okay? And it would need to be somewhere else. So this is just something to think about. And then a third path that comes to my mind in all of that is, if this is, whichever one of those paths this goes down, if this is competitive to EPP, right? So if you go down the second path, this ends up being competitive to EPP, well, that becomes a problem all by itself. because EPP and RDAP, as they are currently defined, are the core protocols that run the registration system. They are standards, okay? And so that automatically means that this thing, if it is something entirely different and it's changing the data model, okay, then it's no longer EPP, it's now competitive to it. And now we have a different set of questions to answer about this work, which is it should probably be experimental, not a standard, right? Because you can't put you don't want to have two standards to do the same thing. And if you are going to bring up another standard to compete with EPP, the question we need to ask ourselves is, what is the motivation for that? And is there sufficient support for moving aside or getting ahead of EPP where we are today? So very quickly, the question I think that we have to think about in whether or not to absorb this work is whether or not it is EPP or not. And, you know, how much do we want to keep it being EPP? Because if it's not, we have a different set of questions to answer and a different way to look at it. I hope all of that made sense. Just wanted to frame that. If people have questions about what I said, you can bring those up too. We now have a long queue here and about 8 minutes left in this session. So just a time check for folks. And Jim Gould, please, you're up next.
Yeah, I'll be brief. I'll mirror what I said in the past. This is a new provisioning protocol. I believe, Jim, it's more than the data model. I've been thinking creatively related to how to comply with ROC 5730 with the various things that are in there, but it simply doesn't. It's a different provisioning protocol. My recommendation is to create a new working group, define the requirements for what needs to be worked on, and then work on it. It's probably the same folks in this working group, but it would warrant a separate working group. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Appreciate that. Jim Reed, you're up next.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I think there's enough wiggle room in the current spec of the charter for the working group that any activity in this area is still going to be within scope. I don't think it makes sense to talk about even talk about rechartering. Usually the sign that a working group needs to recharter is usually a sign indication the working group's in some kind of trouble, and that's certainly not the case we've got here. So I think we can say this is in scope, provided we've got the blessing of the area directors and should just carry on and get the work done. If we have to go through some kind of rechartering exercise, it's going to take far too long to get anywhere, and we'll probably end up with the same result with the same people and the same co-chairs in the same place. So why bother doing it?
Right. Thank you, Jim. Powell, you're next.
Paul Kowalik-Dynik. So I'm very supportive of this work. So I think this is very important work, and I still continue to think that there is no better place in IETF than this group. So basically, this may be defined as experimental in the first place. I think this suggestion is quite good, but this work should continue and should take place here, because as already Jim said, that the group will constitute from the new working group will be probably the same people more or less like here. So why should we form a new group for this?
Thank you, Powell. Pete Resnick, you're next.
Just to disagree with Jim and Pavel a little, I think people shouldn't worry about the idea of chartering a new working group or rechartering this one, assuming the rest of the work is done, which I'm not convinced it is. Chartering a new working group gives you the ability to sort of open up things. What you don't want to end up with is getting into arguments about how a proposal on the table for this doesn't fit into the current charter. And, oh, well, you know, that's too big a change, that's too small a change. If you start with a clean slate, yes, it's going to be the same people. You guys already have 2 sessions this week. Having a third with the same people, or one of each of, we're working on this and we're working on the old EPP stuff, I don't think it logistically makes a difference for this group, but I think it opens up the possibility that you're not as constrained and worried about where in the charter you are. It's not that hard to write a good, easy charter that will allow you to do this stuff, and you'll just do it at a separate time than you're doing the rest of this. So I would really recommend thinking about writing up a new charter and coming up with a new group.
Thank you, Pete. want to add a comment. Just you started by talking about not being concerned about whether you recharter this or not. Yeah, I mean, speaking as chair, in this particular group and for the work that we do here, I will tell you that, you know, my little bit of bias is I like to try and steer people away from talking about whether or not something is in our charter or not in our charter. The question is whether or not the work fits into the kind of work that the group of people in this room do. Whether or not to charter it, that's for a discussion with the area director when you come right down to it. I worry because in this working group, as we all well know, there's really only about 6 of us, you know, who really are engaged in everything. We're a very small group, you know. I mean, in my view, if it is just going to be the same people, I just as soon find a way to keep it in this group. And that's just something to negotiate with the area director, you know, as opposed to a whole new group. But, you know, that's why I said the question here really for me as chair is I want to understand what people think about whether or not this is EPP or something different. I'm hearing a couple of different views on that. I'm not hearing myself a consensus view on that, which is fine. Just want to take in whatever we can get here. But, you know, I want to understand whether or not people think this is EPP or if it is doing something different than EPP, and then we'll figure out the administrative side from that. So thank you. Andy, you're up next.
Yes. So I want to agree with everything Pete Resnick said about trying to start a new working group. That's that can be a kitchen sink exercise. What was that slang? That can be an exercise in trying to figure out what is in and out of scope. So I think a rechartering would be better. I do think this is work that should come into the IETF because we do need new entrants in the market. We also need new people to come into the IETF as well. I think the formulation that Jim you had about the data model, I think that is a good way to think about it and to see if the RESTful EPP proponents can constrain themselves, and I think that would work probably pretty well. I do have a quibble with something that was said, like we can't have 2 provisioning protocols. We currently have many provisioning protocols, and the internet is not going to break. So I don't think we want to go down this path of saying, you know, you guys have to go someplace else. But and I hope that's not what we're saying. But I don't think if we ended up having to get a new working group, I don't think that's a good idea. But and creating a completely new thing, the internet's not going to quit working.
Yeah, and I still think that it still is EPP. It may be different, but it's reusing the existing data model, all the mappings for the objects and support for the extensions. So it's a different way of using EPP, but it's still EPP.
Thank you. Rick?
Rick Wilhelm, PIR. I did not do a super close reading of the draft as apparently Jim Gould did. It seems to me that there should be a way to do an implementation of EPP that minimally changes things such that essentially all that's happening is swapping out TLS and putting in HTTPS. And as if one was taking out TCP and putting in TLS. And when I heard the comments that Gould made, which said it's not EPP, then I'm going to read the draft. I just being clear, I haven't. Like I'm not sure what's in there that would cause us to say that this is such a big change, because it seems to me that it should be possible to write a draft that is only touching the transport and not doing anything else, and only, as Q said, is leaving everything else alone, just doing it, because really I think the key goal for a lot of implementers is the hardest thing that a lot of folks are facing right now is finding engineers that can handle the TLS handshake and that level of programming, because you want to do the HTTPS deployments via AWS and things like that. Yeah, it'd be nice to be able to do some of this stuff in JSON, but once you've gotten the XML code written, it's done and dusted, and you kind of leave it and you don't touch it until the spec changes. But the DevOps work and the TLS stuff and things like that, and debugging that is a problem that we face a lot. right? And so I think that this is a case where a lot of times you say, I think there's a case where the perfect is the enemy of the good. And I would offer that the group that's interested in this stuff might be interested in taking half a loaf. Maybe that's an international saying, but it's at least an American saying. And like, just sort of, as Q was saying, like, keep the XML, get rid of TLS, take HTTPS, get the cloud deployments, avoid having to do that difficult TLS handshake, and kind of take the win. It's a suggestion, as far as like going kind of, and then you don't have to get into this whole thing. Because most of the code is in the ground for a lot of people, that kind of code, whereas the DevOps code and that kind of stuff is much more, I'll stop saying the same thing louder and slower. Thank you.
Yeah, no, you're totally right. So there are a lot of running EPP implementations that work perfectly fine with XML. No need to update them at this point. At some point you need to. But I think for new registrars, smaller registrars, or new registries, starting fresh again, it makes life a lot easier for developers and end users to just be able to use a RESTful API.
Thank you, Rick. Paul, you're next. Just a reminder, time check, folks, we are over time, and it seems clear to me at this point we're going to continue this discussion on the mailing list. So please keep that in mind and try to be brief here. Thanks.
Paul Kowalik. Yeah, so answering the question whether it is EPP or not, so I think this important definition of keeping the data model. So if this group or the new group would be charted, I think one of the questions to answer, what are the design principles for the new thing? And one of the thing that I would like to have is like that the data model will be same or let's say compatible with EPP. So the all this ontologies and everything can be basically reused as is, even if the representation in JSON and the RESTful structure will be basically changed, and maybe some redundancies which are encoded in the paths and the headers will be removed from the representations. But the representation is for me less important than the basically the data structures, which are the let's say deeply encoded into different implementations.
Thank you, Pal. And I believe, Scott, you're jumping over Ori, please.
Right. Thank you, Scott Hollenbeck. One of the ways I'd like to be able to measure data model conformance, right? So my company operates an EPP server. Let's imagine for a moment we have a way of doing this whole transport swap thing, right? But ultimately, if I can take the XML encoded data that comes in via whatever this is called, pump it through my existing XML parser and backend server, and if it can do that and process it all without error, this is a good thing, right? That in my mind is data model preservation. If there is something happening here that causes my server to break, we have something that's incompatible, right? So Martin, I actually read the draft, okay? Thank you. And I was encouraged to see that you're taking steps in that direction, right? And I know you said in the draft, there's a couple of things where it's not quite there yet, right? For example, you described it still as, stateless. However, let me ask you to think about stateful and statefulness in a different way. Who's maintaining the state?
Yeah,
right?
we've had that discussion. You can keep state at the client, for instance.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So I think what you've got in the draft right now, you say it's stateless, but the truth is the client is maintaining the state, right? So I think that's a way we can deal with that particular problem. But again, data model preservation, that's priority number one, I think, for me.
Yeah, so that's the idea. Keep the data model, make the other stuff easier to use. And yeah, so there are questions about where to keep state and stuff like that. So, but the draft is still early, and we just want to know is this something we can invest more time in and work on it, make it better, without ending up in a situation where we spend a lot of time on it, and that the group says, okay, nice try, but this is not something we're going to include in our working group.
Thank you, Scott. And Ori?
Hi, Ori Steele, responsible area director. So we're talking about rechartering, and we're talking about a new working group. I think like you folks have mentioned, there's a lot of interest in this work and in the previous work item as well. With my AD hat on, these don't seem like they fit in your current charter. So I think at a minimum, we're talking about rechartering. And I think don't be afraid to widen your sort of mind around a new working group that can separate the maintenance work that you're going to continue to engage in for EPP and RDAP from the new work. I liked what Pete said around being concerned about the new work and the old work, potentially interacting with each other in a way that makes it difficult for either to progress without interruption. So these are just my thoughts as I sit in the room with you all. We're going to work with the chairs and the other area directors as needed to work on this issue. But for now, I think what we've seen here today is it's not EPP. It's something that's inspired by, similar, almost compatible with, but there's enough difference here that I think we really have to be careful about that, and we have to stick to the charter. Good news, I'm young and I have energy, and I'm potentially naive in how quickly I think I can get this done for us, working together with you all. I'm willing to do that work. So I think main thing I want to say is, like, I like the excitement I see here. Let's make sure we're continuing the conversation on the list, and I'll be working with the chairs. Thanks.
Thank you, Ari. Appreciate that. And thank you, Powell. We'll bring this to the mailing list. I'm sorry, Martin. And we'll bring this to the mailing list, and we'll certainly figure it out from there. Okay. And now we have a discussion. There's obviously been quite some discussion on the mailing list about RFC 9537, which is our redaction document. But over to Andy to walk us through some summary of that, and then we have to check on our path forward. So thanks.
Okay, so RFC 9537. So I have a draft out there discussing limitations on RFC 9537 that have been developed after we tried to do several client implementations. Can you, next slide? So just some background here. 9537 is a new RFC, and what it does is it tries to specifically or explicitly identify parts of an RDAP response that can be redacted using JSON path. This is the abstract of the RFC. Next slide, please. All right, so for just some background on how it works, there's a redacted array that gets put into a JSON, the RDAP response, and in that redacted array, there's this data structure which specifies what type of redaction method you have. There's redaction by removal, redaction by empty value, redaction by partial value, and redaction by replacement value. Depending on which method you have, you can have these different JSON path expressions that go in there. It's either 0, 1, or 2, but that's how it works. So next slide. All right, so at the time that this became an RFC, we only had one implementation of a server. It was an alpha implementation, and there were no known client implementations of the RFC. So this is experience from trying to develop a client. Next slide. What we did to get this, what we did in trying to develop this is we actually developed two clients. One is a web client, and that's the lookup.icann.org. And that was done by an internal team. And then we have a command line client, which is an open source client. There's the GitHub URL. And we had a contractor do that. This contractor is experienced in taking RFCs and developing code from that. They're experienced with RPKI and DNSSEC. We also created a test server, and we had to do this because there were no production servers out there that we can query that have the redaction stuff in there. So we took the same code. So in that same code base that has the command line client, there's also a test server. And Cobanion took that, and they also extended the test server so it could emit the redacted arrays. And then we also created 21 test cases, and we have a Docker file in this other GitHub repository, which will actually spin up the server for you and allow you to query it. And anyone can do that. You can just go in there and look at the code and run the Docker file and spin it up. Next slide. All right, so we quickly ran into what I would call limitations in the RFC, things we thought the RFC could do that it can't do. First off, the first one is the redaction by removal, and this is the default redaction method in 9537. And its JSON path expression is optional. It's given in the pre-path string. And even if it was given, so it's optional, but even if it was given, it should always evaluate to a 0 set. So there is no way for a client to actually be able to identify the parts of the response that were removed because they were removed. So, and that makes sense. But there's still no way for the client to do that. The RFC has this non-normative text that says, hey, just use the name in order to figure out your display logic. That guidance is actually very ambiguous because the name is not a string. It's either a type or a description. So it's either a registered value or not a registered value. And because you can't identify what's being removed, this actually is not, so you can't explicitly look at what you have removed. So it's very hard for the client to be able to signal to the user what's going on. What this kind of reduces redaction by removal to is what I'm trying to conceptually call redaction by notice. So, and I'll talk about that in a minute later. Oh, sorry, next. Redaction by empty value. So that's the other one. And this is another place where the RFC is very ambiguous. So the text talks about empty strings and setting everything to, or setting other things to null. Well, so first off, an empty array or an empty object are not null in JSON. They're just empty bracketed things. But the other thing is you can't go setting arbitrary values in an RDAP response to null. That's just not something that's doable. It's not allowable in the spec, and you will break things if you do that. There was an argument, or sorry, a discussion on the list that said, hey, well, 9083 talks about null, but it really is something that's informative text. Nowhere in the RFC does it say you can just go insert null. The same is true for RFC 7095 with the JCard RFC. It talks about null in exactly one place, and it's informative text describing what the primitives are in JSON. It doesn't say you can go insert it anywhere. All right. So for all practical purposes, redaction by empty value is only applicable to strings. Next slide. So redaction by partial value is also kind of ambiguous in what the RFC says it has to be for a formatted value. So that's kind of, what does that mean? I think we can say, well, we know what a formatted value into a string is, but what's a formatted value for a null or a Boolean or whatever? So that's somewhat ambiguous as to what it means. The other part with redacted by partial value is it can't actually identify, like in a string, or even if you could use it against an object or array, it doesn't identify the part that was redacted. It just points to it and says, something over here was redacted. So there's no way for the client to actually signal to the user what was redacted. The part in, so this is very important for RDAP because in RDAP you have a lot of redaction for things like postal addresses or parts of postal addresses. And not every postal address is a structured postal address. JCard allows for unstructured postal addresses, which are just strings. I know I didn't create JCard, okay? But it's still just strings separated by carriage returns. And those, when you pull out something from that string, there's no way for the client to understand what part was pulled out because it's not tagged. The other thing is that there are things in RDAP where you have remarks and notices, and there's other data in there that could constitute personal data, which is something that would be subject to a lot of redaction policies themselves. Next slide.
For Scott, you have a clarifying question? You want? Okay, thanks.
And then finally, there's redaction by replacement value. And because this kind of plays off of the redaction by removal by using the pre-path string, which is optional, redaction by replacement value can't actually understand what was being replaced if it was removed. So next slide. The other thing that we ran into, and this was like running into like a buzzsaw, was JSON path itself. JSON path is inappropriate for this use case. I'm not going to say JSON path is inappropriate for all use cases, but for this use case it is. I have that link up there. This is an excellent website that someone has put together where they took dozens and dozens of JSON path implementations and all the things you can do with JSON path and tried to find the compatibilities. And it's just JSON path is just not interoperable at all. So our experience was we never found a single JSON path library that implemented everything faithfully. We found some that came close, but we never could find anyone that did everything that we were supposed to do. What that meant was our developers were constantly trying to do workarounds and fix-ups, and they're parsing JSON path on their own, blah, blah, blah. So it's very fraught with frustration from a client's perspective. Yeah, next slide. The other thing about the way RFC 9537 is put together is it is quite complex for the client itself. And so, I had these two development teams. I was doing code reviews for them, and they were bouncing ideas off of me. They had some choice quotes about RFC 9537, which, I thought I would put up here, but I decided to redact them. So I'm glad that joke landed. Anyway, but here's the thing. So in RDAP, to do RFC 9537, the client has to go annotate every bit of the RDAP model, and that's quite a big forklift for any client to have to do. And depending on how they do the representation internally in their data model, especially if they're using JSON itself, they have to go through this two-step parsing process, or at least some sort of annotation process. And that is quite a significant change to how most of the RDAP clients work today. Next slide. So since I put the draft on the mailing list, and we started talking about this on the mailing list, the RFC authors have said, no, JSON path is completely optional, and they've filed 2 erratas about that. That may have been an intent, but that's not how the RFC reads, okay? So the RFC's abstract does say, using JSON path, there are several places in the RFC that says, we explicitly identify or explicitly specify RDAP values. There are 22 examples of redaction in the draft. Not a single one of them has JSON path as being optional. So, and also there's a section 5 in there, which is quite lengthy, which is all about JSON path. So you cannot hand this RFC to someone who didn't have the benefit of reading the mailing list and have them come away saying, oh, JSON path is optional. Next slide. The other thing, and I've mentioned this earlier, if JSON path is optional, this reduces 9537 to just redaction by notice. And if we had intended to do that, there is already a notice mechanism in RDAP called notices, which we could have used, and it's actually a little more flexible in the fact that you can repeat them, and you can repeat them in multiple languages, and there are links they can have to redaction policies. You can't do that with the redaction draft, or the redaction RFC. Next slide. Redaction by notice is also not very good UI. So one of the things you end up doing, so a lot of RDAP clients, because it's structured data, they tend to take the data and they tend to visually separate certain parts of the entities from the other parts of the response to make it more visually appealing, make it more readable, and so forth. Well, a notice gets mixed in with all the things like terms and conditions, and here's the status codes and stuff like that. That's often displayed at the bottom of an RDAP response. So what it does is, from a UI perspective, this separates the redaction notice from where the redaction takes place. And we already have a mechanism. If we wanted to do that, there's already a mechanism called remarks in RDAP that could have done this anyway. Next slide. This is also, when you think about that, this is actually worse than what you get with whois. So in whois today, when people do redaction, they just put redacted next to the thing that they're redacting. If you have a redaction by notice and you're taking that notice and you're separating it from where the thing has been redacted, it's not as good of a UI experience. Next slide. Thanks to Mario, he brought this up on the mailing list. So you can kind of tweak the redaction by notice and get this thing called, to conceptually put a name on it, redacted by registered notice. And this is where you actually have the registered value in the redacted array. And so that's in an IANA registry. The problem with that is you can have conflicting IANA registry values. Some may be used for removal. Some may be used for empty value. That's not actually in the registry. That's in the redaction notice itself. So there are all sorts of problems with this. It also turns the IANA registry into a pseudo specification, which I think is kind of not what we want for IANA registries. And it's not as precise or flexible as an algorithmic or programmatic method. So this is not very flexible, especially for smaller registries like ccTLDs or so forth. If they want to get something that's redacted, they would have to go put something into the registry and then hope that the client implementers come along at some point and notice it. And I think a lot of implementers, when they implement 9537, if they implement it, they're only going to look at that registry once. They're not going to come back and constantly look at it and constantly update it. Next slide. The other thing is, even in the GTLD space, this is not ideal. If you look at .nyc, they have this thing called the Nexus contact, and there's a Nexus policy. So they have redaction requirements that go above and beyond, or they go further than what the standard GTLD redaction policies are anyway. They would have to, or any other GTLD that comes along that has to do this kind of thing, they would have to hope that the RDAP client implementers are paying attention to that IANA registry so they can put that business logic in there. Next slide. And then there was a comment about, hey, we just need to wait and see. I don't know what the wait and see is going to be about. I don't think JSON Path is going to get any better. It's been around for 10 years, I think, or something like that. I know it's a new RFC, but it's been around for a while, and you have these wildly varying implementations. The other thing is, wait and see does not address the actual problems that are inherent with 9537 itself. So next slide. All right. I just want everyone to remember that the Tao of the Internet is rough consensus and running code, and that protocols, even though they're a proposed standard, the part of the process is once implementers get a hold of them, if we find problems, we're supposed to try to address those problems. Yeah, and I also want to point out that this working group, unlike if you go into DNSOP or if you go into CyberOps or something like that, you'll see a lot of implementers getting feedback and getting their stuff into the protocols. This working group doesn't have a lot of client implementers giving us feedback. This is one of the rare occasions, and so I don't think we should dismiss it. And that's it.
Okay, thank you. Before you walk away, I'm hopeful that you want to ask you one question, and then I know that you want to sit down and just let the conversation take place, and I'll manage all that unless, right? Or wait.
I can stand here and take questions.
You want to? Okay. Well, then I'm going to, chair's prerogative, I'm going to ask the first question. Did you see Jody's note on the mailing list about him doing a client implementation and his reaction to that? And he posted some data about that. Do you have any kind of response to that or comment to make about what he did versus what you've done with two different sets of implementer teams?
So I don't think that was on the REGEXT mailing list. If it was, I didn't see it.
Yeah, it was.
When
Okay,
was it?
yeah, I'm getting some other nods. So, yeah, okay, so I'm not crazy. Okay, well, that's fine.
Can you describe what he said?
His Jody Coker GoDaddy. So he gave it to his team to do, and his team put together a client implementation in 2 hours. That's really the nut of what he said, and didn't have any issues. And I just reporting what was there. It's okay. You don't have to have a comment, but I thought maybe you might have had some thoughts about it.
Did he do the JSON Path as optional thing, or?
Don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we'll just run the queue at this point. So that's fine. Okay. Scott, you're up first.
Thank you, Jim. Scott Hollenbeck. Andy, a lot of what you described here, clarifications required, ambiguity, et cetera. I mean, there is a reason that this document is a proposed standard, and that's we know we probably didn't get it right out of the gate, right? And we have processes to deal with ambiguities, errors, corrections required. What about the possibility of developing a BIS draft that attempts to deal with the issues that you've identified? Is that something that might be helpful, even if it ends up being a fairly significant rewrite?
I mean, yeah, we can do a BIS. I'm not standing up here to say not to do a BIS. Actually, I don't really know what the way forward is. Yeah. So if the working group wants to do a BIS, I'm up here trying to identify the problems. So next.
Okay. Thank you, Tom Harrison.
I think I generally support the comments that are in favor of letting this run for a bit, not jumping straight into some sort of BIS process. I think there are a couple of things. RIPE are relying on this already. So RIPE are returning IDAP responses in reliance on this document. I think even JSON pathless use of redacted is still better than with notices, because you know that it's about redaction and there's extra metadata and stuff like that. It seems premature to say that there'll never be a good implementation of JSON path per 9535. I have spent some time looking at JSON path implementations, and it is pretty awful, but that's what 9535 has kind of pointed out. So I think, which goes towards letting that run for a bit longer. And whatever replaces this, it can't just be string replacement of values with placeholder things like redacted or whatever, because then that just breaks existing clients. It's got to, whatever it does, it's going to have to omit fields from the responses, and as soon as it has to omit fields, it's going to have to identify that in some way, and that goes to either some sort of JSON expression language like JSON path, or some sort of registry which describes what's being omitted. So you end up in basically the same problem space as redacted ends up in, it seems to me. Yep.
Nope. Okay. Thank you, Tom. Jim Gould, you're next.
Yeah, I'll second Scott's comments related to following the process. In creating a biz draft would make a lot of sense, but I do agree with the comments that Jody Coker put on the mailing list that we need more implementation experience. There will be implementations coming up very, very soon, and it would be great if we got that experience incorporated into a biz draft. So I would wait a little bit before starting on the biz draft, but pretty much I believe it can be implemented by a client by using the required name and method fields in the draft. And I want to point out that we spent 2.5 years on this draft. We made many updates, including making the path expressions optional and making the name number required. So the working group did consider these elements, and we can learn from the implementation experience and make updates based on those. Thanks.
Well, the path expressions are not optional in the current RFC. And if you read it that way, if that's what you want to do, then you're basically turning this into redaction by notice. And that is a worse user experience overall.
We've disagreed on the mailing list related to this, but I did go ahead and create the errata to hopefully clarify this. And we could also add a errata related to the examples, because those examples just weren't updated, because originally the path expressions were required, so therefore all the examples had them. So I could understand the confusion on that. So when we made them optional, the examples should have been updated to make a mix. So that could be certainly updated in the biz draft. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Oh, and Jody is out there. Jody, please.
Hi, can you guys hear me okay? This is Jody Coulter.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I want to just do a point of clarification. We did the server implementation here. We did not do a client implementation for RDAP. So I just wanted to clear that up. Basically, GoDaddy's server implementation is rather simple. Most everything is redacted due to GDPR, etc. You know, and the other thing that I want to add is, yes, the examples are a little strange. They do not, you know, have the type in there, because those types didn't exist in the IANA registry yet. And I think it would be clarifying a great deal if we could redo this without the type and without having the JSON path in there being required, which is what the errata does. The other thing that I have that I'm curious about is that it seems like we're making this very easy for clients to do. You know, when you're parsing things like this, you kind of already know where the registrant name is. I understand the whole JSON path and needing to get to that, but it seems like clients are trying to make this into basically a text version that they can display nicely to people. I'm going to say in a nice way instead of displaying JSON, correct? So they're going to have to put in like registrant name, registrant street, registrant city, all of that stuff. And there's really not a JSON path to that. People just, programmers are reading that and saying, here's the registrant and here's the address information. I mean, when you put in the registrant name saying that that is redacted, I mean, I think from my perspective, I'm going to know where that's at. I don't necessarily need a JSON path to get to that. Thanks.
So I mean, what you're describing is the redacted by registered notice, where the each client has to implement separate business logic in order, what we call business logic, in order to know what was redacted, and that is doable. I mean, that's what would happen if you got rid of the JSON path anyway. But it's not very flexible for, especially for smaller registries who need to go put something in, or they need to respond to some sort of policy that might only apply to them, because then it requires the client implementers to constantly go look at that IANA registry. Yeah, is that it?
No, a couple more. Jody, any additional reaction or?
Sure. My reaction to that is that if you're doing a client that's supposed to display all this information, you're going to have to look at your code again and redo it, because you don't want to have the client displaying JSON to the end user. My experience, or what I'm assuming, Andy, is that this client is supposed to parse everything out of here and display it to the customer in the same way that Whois is doing, right?
So, but it's different though, right? Because then Whois all of the tags and everything, that's just straight text that comes directly from the server. Whereas in JSON, in RDAP, you can have these things in multiple places, and you have to be able to go if you're doing it by registered notice, you can have overlaps, and it does have to know, like, there's business logic to say, I know this thing is embedded in this part of the JSON, and there's this whole, a whole bunch of nested arrays, or nested structures. So it is much different when it comes to JSON. You are correct that a good RDAP client, a generalized RDAP client, because there are specialized ones, does have to take that JSON and parse it and display it. But just saying I'm doing a registrant name, that could be, I mean, there are multiple entities that could be in there. Or if you just say I'm just doing an entity name, that's really ambiguous. And that's actually how it would be, how it's represented in the JSON. It doesn't say registrant name. The thing is name in the J card, right? So,
I understand. So if a small CCTLD is going to update their RDAP to include more information in it, then it's going to have to be reprogrammed by the clients also. So having to look into the IANA registry, I don't think is going to be a hardship for that, when they're going to have to be relooking at the code anyway to be able to display the new information.
Well, the registries aren't the ones writing the clients. It's just the different client implementers that are.
I understand, but the registries are the ones that are writing the server, and they're changing their RDAP, which is causing an issue for the clients, and they're going to have to update the client.
Okay.
Okay. Well, so thank you. Thank you, Jody. I think all of that was a good discussion. We have two more people in the queue here. Jazip.
Hi, interesting discussion. I think I have just a couple of points. And we at Erin haven't done redaction right now. First is, I really appreciate the generic client's viewpoint. And that probably as a way of working for this group is pretty important. When we talk about interoperability of a standard, generally it's between a client and a server. And there are a few generic clients out there, meaning they need, to what Andy was saying, a more programmatic way. That's first point I wanted to say, that please let's not ignore client-centric input. Second interesting thing is, and I think we all kind of very proudly said that this can pinpoint accurately the redacted values. And we all know what redaction looks like if you have ever looked at a document with some blackened out stuff, right? And clearly it is generally in situ. It's like, what that means is it's in place. So from a human friendliness point of view, you can actually see it. Oh, this is something I'm not allowed to see. But from the client perspective, again, that's where this visualization happens.
I think clients would desire that accuracy pinpointing. And now the debate is, okay, start ignoring JSON path expressions, for instance, right? As we are trying to say here. But I just want to remind the group that making JSON path optional does not absolve us of the identified issues. I mean, we can discuss these identified issues on their technical merit, right? And just making it them optional doesn't sort of remove the problem. So I don't know. So in summary, client viewpoint, I think, is very important. And frankly, we should think that carefully. Pinpointing is important for redaction, and especially for more complex generalized clients. And any expression language we pick, right, to Tom's point earlier, if there are issues, making it a may does not make them go away. Thanks.
Thank you, Jessup. Powell?
Paul Kowalik-Denik. I just wanted to comment on the JSON path issue. So we made this optional out of the reason that you mentioned that the if object is not there, it's kind of pointless to put a path to something that is not existing there. Well, maybe if you have a generalized model in the client out of the graph specification, you can think of, okay, this path should be pointing to this object which is not there, but it's not that reliable. I think it's highly useful for data which has been redacted in place, so you can pinpoint exactly to the place where the data is changed. And I think there is a value in it. If the JSON path was the best tool, well, it's a standard. It's now published. So, well, should we consider that the implementations are not yet there for this standard when putting the standard on top of it? Yes, no, there's an open question, but I don't think it was that much of a bad approach to base on it.
I suggest that you go to the website I put up on JSON path. That will probably change your mind about its interoperability. I mean, we ran into things with JSON path where it didn't even support the bracket notation, and that's like an obvious thing.
I'm not claiming that it is. It's the question whether if something is put as a fresh standard here at IETF, should we consider this yet or no, or to base our, let's say, our work on it, because it may influence also other areas in this sense. Yeah.
Okay, we'll let Rick jump in here. Quick 2-minute.
Thanks. Rick Wilhelm, PIR. I want to extraordinarily gently disagree with something that Jasdeep said, because Jasdeep is a gentle soul himself. And he's rarely wrong. He talked about redacting in situ, and kudos for the Latin. With this response, there really is no in situ, because there's not in my perspective, having worked on this RDAP redaction stuff since it was first brought up years ago, there is no place where this stuff is redacted. There's not a sequence of these. There's not sequence. And so that's kind of the only point of that. Like, there's not a spot where it's like being blacked out or sharpied out or something like that. And so it's kind of, we're used to seeing old school 853 or whatever the RFC who is responses where they're kind of, Andy had an example of there, but there really isn't like that in RDAP. And so there isn't a place where there's not a sequence of these responses. So I just kind of offer to that folks that when they're thinking about these things, that there's not really a sequence of these things. Thank you.
So in current RDAP today, you will see some servers responding the very same way you see some of the whois servers. They just say if there's a name or something redacted for privacy, and that's very, very common.
All right. Okay, thank you, Andy. Here's my takeaway from all of this as chair. You know, we've had a very substantial implementers experience documented and provided to us. I think that as a working group, you know, we have a responsibility to consider, you know, how to respond to that. You know, one suggestion that was certainly put out here in the room was to attempt a biz version of the document. and incorporating all the things that I think needs to be there. I want to remind us that another option is just, explicit suggestions on, gee, if this little bit of text was this, that would help a lot, kind of thing. And then we can figure out, the original document authors can still have ownership of writing a biz document and what to do with it. But in any case, I think this discussion moves to the mailing list as we continue to evaluate what's here and what we want to do with it. And that's the right thing to do. That is process from my point of view. Okay, we are way behind schedule at this point. However, I've only been squeezing myself. The last 3 presentations are actually mine, and I'm at the end, and I'm hopeful that we can still get them in the 20 minutes that's remaining. So that's the time check here. And so we're just going to quickly jump into each of these and see where that takes us. These slides are actually loaded. These were all loaded this morning, but I think you'll be able to read them here and see what's here. I really was just trying to put some data points up here to spark our discussion. In the contact objects, just like the versioning and signaling discussion in the next one, these discussions started earlier this year. And I think at the time, there was certainly some interest in doing something with these things. They're like, oh, this sort of felt interesting. In the case of the contact objects, I mean, yes, contact objects are well defined, they're broadly deployed. The EPP specification, 5733 in particular, clearly defines a contact object, and there's really no question about that. It's a standard. So it is where we are, and that's the baseline. Part of what motivated some of this was JS Contact coming along, and it kind of proposed a new specification, if you will, being a little loose with that phrasing there, for a contact object, moving it from XML to JSON, because they had a community of people that sort of wanted to do that, and that's a reasonable thing. But it did raise the question of, gee, is this a new thing? Is it a competitive thing? And what does all of that mean? And what are the consequences of it? And then simple contact became something that was just sort of tossed out in discussion, which was interesting. The realization that, at least in our registration system, yes, we inherited the J card idea of a contact object, but bottom line, when you think about it in registration systems, in our domain registration system, we don't need most of what's in J card. And it does sort of beg the question of, why did we adopt all of that? Why didn't we start with something simple? So the whole notion of simple contact was sort of attractive and interesting at the time, but it never really moved anywhere. So the question is what to do with this discussion. Is there a problem to be solved here? What do we think we're doing? Is there a competitive contact object definition that we really want to consider? And do we really have some particular motivation for doing that? I think it's fair to say that the simple contact idea has kind of been shelved. So, it really kind of isn't out there and a real consideration. JS Contact does seem to have a community. Do we want to think of it as competitive to EPP, or do we want to let the JS Contact stuff move forward finally, and be experimental instead and let it go on its own path and see what happens to it in the market, that kind of thing. So that's kind of where we are. To make it concrete, I would say that we should consider this. We should take JS Contact, let it go to experimental, with the exception of dealing with the signaling issue, which we'll get to in the next section. And consider this closed, and we're done with this discussion. So interested in comments. Andy, you're up, please.
Yeah, as the author of Simple Contact, I kind of disagree with it does not have wide available. I can't remember actually what you had on that slide. Anyway, I do think what happened with Simple Contact was Mark Blanchett made a very interesting statement. I think it was on the mailing list, that we really only need, if we're going to replace JCard, we only need one solution going forward. And so Mario, who was doing the JS Contact, pared down some of the things in JS Contact that made it. I don't think it's as good as Simple Contact, but at certain point, we're talking about style issues here, and so that's why we shelved Simple Contact, because Mario did pare down some of the stuff in the JS Contact draft. Now I read JS Contact just recently, and there's some other things that I think need clarifications. I think JS Contact would be a lot more palatable if it removed its signaling and transition sections in there. Also, I think it was offered that we take JS Contact to experimental, maybe, because again, Mark Blanchett made another statement. We've already got the sunk cost of JCard. I'm not a big fan of JCard, but I've written that code several times, both for clients and servers, and it's not hard. It's just a little confusing. So,
thank you, Powell.
Yeah, Paweł Kwalik. I think the problem to solve was actually had its origin at the discussion of reduction, because Andy presented this ugly expression, let's say, and actually it had this. The reason why this expression was like this of the JSON path was because how the contact structure is expressed in AirDAP, and then everyone had a feeling, okay, we can do it better. And I think JS Contact has the other issue, but it's generalized for other purposes, and probably it's too much. So if JS Contact would be the answer, I would be very positive to profile it, to just narrow it down to the features that we really have in the registration context, rather than just taking the generic specification as this and live with all the let's say downs and highs of it. Yeah, so this would be my take. But this problem with the reduction of the current representation is existing, and it won't go away. So maybe we should put a holistic view on it.
Okay, thank you for that. Before I try to summarize and suggest a concrete action, let me get through these next couple of slides on this topic. Again, similar to the contact discussion, it partly was born out of JS Contact because it has that transition signaling mechanism built into it, into the spec, and Andy kind of just made reference to that in his intervention in the last section. And we, along the way, had these other three, I don't know, semi-related documents, right? I mean, versioning, extensions, X-media type. We took them on board. Originally, we accepted them as a working group item because we felt like, oh, there's actually a problem to solve here. Although we didn't clearly define at the time that we took them on what that problem was, I think we kind of had a sense that, gee, we should say something about versioning and signaling, and we should figure out what that really needs to look like and solve those problems. And one or more of these documents might be the right baseline, or an opportunity to integrate some features. And so that was kind of what we had intended to do. From my point of view as chair, when I went back and I was trying to look at all this and look at some of the old discussion about this, I've had a couple of people come up to me privately and separately suggest, well, gee, I thought we knew what problem we were solving. And I would just observe that, well, yeah, we sort of had an idea what we wanted to do, but I never felt like we actually stated in so many words on the mailing list that this is what we're doing. And additionally, no one actually stepped up and said, okay, I'm going to lead the process of moving this forward in this way. And as we all know, work doesn't progress unless somebody is going to actually move it forward and volunteers for it, right? So you need someone who's going to do that. Or we never actually, had that kind of traction. So, I think that, frankly, for me, consensus is really still not apparent. I sense some ambiguity. I mean, I think there's still some interest in, trying to deal with providing some guidance for RDAP extensions. At least, a few people have indicated they like that topic. The notion of being able to version extensions seems like something there's at least a couple of people interested in. Working consensus is always a hard thing for me to judge. And my co-chair, Antoine, although he's not with us, would agree with me on that point. He and I often have interesting debates about whether we have consensus on something or not, which is always helpful. It's always good to have another voice in these things. So, it is really kind of a question to us here. Is there a problem, or is there no problem? I frankly, my leaning, I'm just going to put it out there right up front here and see what discussion we get from folks. My leaning is that, yes, there actually is interest, and I think we can get enough people together to deal with this notion of providing guidance to extension developers and addressing this versioning issue. I think that the RDAP extensions document is the right baseline document to take that from, but that doesn't have to be taken as gospel here. We can go to one of the others. You know, once the working group decides that they clearly want to solve this problem, if we want to start somewhere else, that's fine with me. I'm certainly not going to make this happen in a certain way. I do want to, you know, take note of Jim Gould's recent message on the mailing list, which I think was Monday. You know, I mean, I think he had a very articulate and really good message in talking about these three documents here and distinguishing them, and at the same time, you know, indicating where they could be moved together and maybe they should be combined and turned into something. So, you know, I think there's work to be done here. I really do. I think there's at least a leaning on a set of people to do it. And so I'll end with this point, and then we'll take some discussion here. Ultimately, for this stuff to move forward, somebody has to step up and say, hey, I'm going to take, you know, pen to paper, be the editor for this, and we'll help to move the discussion along in the mailing list. And that's kind of where I am. So I want to, we need to get to a clear articulation of what we're doing, perhaps what I've said on the slide here, and we'll finish that decision obviously on the mailing list. And somebody has to volunteer to move it forward. And I think that's where we are. So with that, Andy, please, you're first up in the queue.
What do you mean by someone has to take the pen? I don't. I'm not clear on what you're actually asking. Are you? I mean, because we have authors for these drafts. Are you trying to say we need to put together a I forget what you call those things, a design group or something? Design team. That's
design team. The way that our group has worked, I mean, this actually, in my experience here, this is a unique circumstance for us in this working group. Okay, I know what other working groups have done, but in our working group, usually we only have one document that comes forward, and then we all work around that document. So there's already a document editor or author, whatever you know, however you want to do that, where it's coming from, and we move forward. This really is an unusual situation for us. So I kind of picked one, but honestly, we have three documents. Any one of the set of authors for any one of those three can stand up and say, I want my document to be the starting point. Here it is. Now let's talk about whether it solves the problem that we've decided we're trying to solve or not.
So I think those three I mean, they're all doing something different. The RDAP X media type is about client signaling to the server about what extensions it wants. The versioning is about the server being able to say what versions of extensions it has. And the extensions document is really all about best practice, well, not just best practices, but taking care of a lot of the ambiguities that exist in the current RFCs. And we have current extensions that are in the RDAP registry, which violate some of the things that people think are what the extensions are supposed to do. So the extensions draft is really about how to take care of all those ambiguities. And it was really about, let's try to take all those discussions, those high level conceptual discussions where everyone was like kind of talking past each other on the mailing list for the last 4 years, and let's get that solved. And that's what that is. Yeah, so I mean, in my opinion, that should be something we do. The other stuff, I could see how we could maybe prioritize it or something. I don't know.
Okay, so just to be clear, my takeaway from that is all three of these documents deserve the opportunity to go forward independently. And you just want that particular option to be on the table here.
So just to get to Jim Gould's comment, I saw the mail he sent. It was a lot, so I didn't quite digest everything he was saying. I do think that the versioning and the media type, I don't know if they can be merged. They do have to be compatible, and I think that's true. So yeah, we could take both of those forward. I read the last. Actually, he just published a new version of the versioning. I haven't read that, but I think they are compatible. But we could maybe, and I don't know, make sure that they work together. I think is what we need to do. So,
okay, thank you. I am going to lock the queue. Time check. We got 6 minutes here, people. And Scott, no, Andy, you're up. Oh, you were up next. Scott, you're up next.
Scott Hollenbeck. Let me just build on and echo what Andy just said here, right? I see value in all three of these. I definitely think we need an RDAP equivalent of RFC 3735, which was, guidelines for extending EPP. I like the idea of taking a really good close look at these and seeing, which pieces need to be consistent with each other, and maybe which pieces of the versioning draft and the ex-media draft need to find their way into the extensions draft. I mean, if they're describing a best practice for extensions. So let me stop talking, give someone else some time to talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Jim Gould, you're next.
Yeah, I see a path for all three drafts, and I could even see the extensions draft going broader. Scott brought up a good point related to RFC 3735 for EPP. So there's a lot of ambiguity within RDAP that we could help address in the extensions draft. Is related to the versioning and the ex-media. I just thought that they could be merged. They don't need to be merged. They solve different problems, but the versioning draft itself does have a normative reference to the ex-media draft related to how to signal from the client what extensions are desired from the server. So I see them all being applicable. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Powell?
So I slightly disagree that there is no overlap between the specs. So the versioning specification has also specified the way of signaling for the client to the server, which also the media type does. So I would rather like to have these two concepts merged into one, which is dealing with, let's say, signaling between servers and the clients of the versioning and the supported extensions. I think this will be of benefit.
Okay, thank you, Powell. And Jim, you want to add something?
Yeah, I do. An update was made to the versioning draft to include support for signaling via query parameter as well as ex-media. So, and it provided the requirement that the server support both. So that's the way we're able to solve, I guess, or use both mechanisms. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Wow, very, very engaged and quick discussion, all this. I love it. My takeaway from this is that each of these documents deserves an opportunity to move forward. To the extent there's a relationship between them, we need to find that in our discussions so that we can make sure the documents are compatible and we don't do anything against each other. And then to get back to the question that Andy asked me way up front, that just means that, as always, the document authors for each of the documents need to press on moving their individual documents forward on the mailing list. And that's the way that would happen. So this notion that these things are on hold because we're trying to figure out what to do with them is the issue that we've closed at this point. And Ori, you put yourself in the queue. Please go ahead. We got 3 minutes to do my last topic, but I think I can handle it. Go ahead.
Oh, you have one more topic. I'll let you go.
Okay. I probably should have just put these up right away. All right. I can do this quickly, I believe, because, this is not the right set of slides. Gee. Yeah, I'll have to talk to the chair about the fact that those are not the right set of slides. Okay, well, here's the real point in all of this. There's another slide. I'll put up revised slide deck up because it has much more information. It's got a couple of links in it too. We had the joint meeting between ICANN Tech Ops and REGEXT back in May. And the purpose of that meeting was really to expose to a broader set of actual registries and registrars, because we really only have a few here in this group in the IETF side. But on the ICANN side, I hit a fora. The Tech Ops group is a great place to hit a broader set of GTLD registries and registrars. So kind of brought this topic there. And what it was myself and Arndt in particular who kind of presented to the group at large and exposed this proposal that we had for how to deal with IDN variants. IDN variants, there's a policy work that's been under development for a couple of years in ICANN about how to deal with IDN variants, at least at a policy level. And what we need to understand here is there is very clearly some technical work to be done. EPP in its current form and RDAP in its current form, just don't support IDN variants. And so as GTLD registries and registrars, we need to be able to do something. So there's work that has to happen. We actually, Arndt and I do have a draft. Some others have joined us on the draft. I see Edmund is back here now too. We actually had a meeting earlier yesterday, I guess it was. We kind of dug in on this thing too. And there's been a few other people in the ICANN community, technical people I've been working with very closely. So we actually have internally to ourselves, we have a working document. And what we expect to do, what we will do in the coming weeks is we will eventually publish an internet draft, and it'll be an individual draft. And at that point, then the work will become fully featured and exposed for everybody. And then we'll be asking for this working group to adopt, looking at the extensions that we're proposing for EPP and for RDAP to support IDN variants, the ability to meet the needs of this proposal that is going to come out of ICANN. And that's where that'll be. So there'll be plenty of time. I had thought about actually what I had done in the slide deck, in the revised slide deck, is I put a couple of slides in there to talk about the technical principles and guiding principles for the work that we were doing. Figured I was going to expose that to this group here. We don't really have time anyway, but I'll get the new slides up there so you'll be able to see that, and we'll be in good shape as far folks will be able to look at that. And then when you see the draft, we can consider this working group adopting the work. And then we'll go from there. It'll be fully open here to the IETF. So Jim Reed, you're in the queue, please.
Quick question, Jim. Just a question of clarification. Will this promised draft have a clearer indication of the problem statement? I'm not sure about what the difference is going to be to support these IDN variants, and maybe other people in a similar position to me.
Yes, it will. In fact, I can succinctly tell you what the problem statement is. The problem statement is with IDN variants, you have to deal with domain names as a set. And that's a fundamental shift in obviously our overall architecture, which is individual names. If that would have been in the revised slides, if I had gotten them posted there, you would have seen that actually. But that's the fundamental technical principle that changes everything, and why there's some things that are needed. So, and I apologize for the quickness of that. We're actually already 2 minutes over queue, but please, Ori, and if anybody has any other business, think about whether you want to raise your hand in a moment, and we'll do that too. Go ahead, Ori.
I just wanted to thank you for a wonderful meeting, all of the engagement, a very active list discussion, and a bunch of open work. I look forward to talking with you about the opportunities to recharter or contribute to the charter for potentially a new group with some narrow focus and clear milestones on some of these issues, perhaps. Feel free to come grab me in the hallway if you want to have a discussion. Thanks again to our chairs for running successful meetings at this IETF. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ari. Appreciate that. Anyone have any other business they want to jump up and allow? This really has been a great meeting, this particular 2 hours. Very engaging. I really appreciate all of the discussion, all the comments, and look forward to moving forward. We've got a lot of good stuff and opportunity in front of us. So thanks again. Thanks to Rick for making some notes for us. We're adjourned, folks.